To understand the specific cold sweat terror that gripped the American armored crews in the winter of 1944, you have to understand the math of the Western Front. It was a math that didn't add up. For the average crew of an M4 Sherman tank, 5 men living inside a rattling, gasoline-smelling steel box, the equation of survival was terrifyingly simple. If they saw a German Panzer IV, the fight was fair. If they saw a Panther, the fight was desperate, requiring a 3-to-1 advantage to flank the German Cat. But if they saw a Tiger, the monstrous 60-ton predator of the Wehrmacht, the math said they were already dead. By late 1944, Tiger phobia was a genuine clinical condition among Allied troops. It didn't matter that the Tigers were rare, mechanical divas that broke down constantly and drank fuel like it was water. When they worked, they were the kings of the battlefield. The Tiger's 88mm KWK-36 gun could punch through the frontal armor of a Sherman from 2 kilometers away, a distance so great the American gunner couldn't even see the muzzle flash. Conversely, the Sherman's 75mm gun, and even the upgraded 76mm, would simply bounce off the Tiger's thick hide like pebbles thrown at a bank vault. American crews watched their armor-piercing shells shatter against the German steel, leaving nothing but a gray smudge, while the Tiger slowly traversed its turret, took aim, and turned the Sherman into a burning coffin. They called the Shermans Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, because they lit up the first time, every time. This imbalance was the defining nightmare of the European theater. But nowhere was this nightmare more vivid, more concentrated, and more terrifying than in the frozen hell of the Ardennes forest during the Battle of the Bulge. And the epicenter of that collision was a place called Elsenborn Ridge. In December 1944, Hitler launched his last desperate gamble, Operation Watch on the Rhine. He threw his remaining armored reserves, the elite SS Panzer divisions, against the thin American lines in Belgium. The goal was to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. The spearhead of this attack, the 6th Panzer Army, was equipped with the best tanks Germany had left. They had the Tiger Is, and they had the terrifying Tiger IIs, the King Tigers, 70-ton behemoths with sloped armor that was theoretically impenetrable to any Allied gun in existence. At Elsenborn Ridge, the northern shoulder of the Bulge, the American 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions dug in. They were the cork in the bottle. If they broke, the Germans would have a clear road to the Meuse River. The battle that followed was a contest of wills. It was men against machines. The American infantry fought with a savagery that stunned the SS. They used bazookas, anti-tank mines, and artillery called down on their own coordinates to strip the German tanks of their infantry support. But when the Tigers came, the panic set in. There are accounts from Elsenborn of American tank destroyer crews watching their rounds bounce harmlessly off the advancing German armor. The M10 and M36 tank destroyers, with open tops and thin armor, were ambush predators, not brawlers. They would fire, see the spark of a non-penetration, and then frantically try to reverse into the tree line before the 88mm retribution arrived. The Germans, sitting inside their steel fortresses, felt invincible. They laughed at the American tin cans. At Elsenborn, the Germans were eventually stopped not by better tanks, but by sheer volume of artillery and the heroism of infantrymen freezing in foxholes. The Americans held the ridge, but they held it with flesh and blood, paying a horrific price because they lacked a machine that could look a tiger in the eye and not blink. The reports from the Bulge filtered back to Washington and Detroit, written in blood and frustration. "Our guns are useless," the tankers wrote. "Send us something that can kill them." The American doctrine had been flawed. The generals believed that tanks shouldn't fight other tanks. That was the job of the tank destroyers. Tanks were for infantry support and exploitation. But the Germans didn't care about American doctrine. They kept building monsters, and the American crews were paying for the mistake. However, deep in the bureaucratic machinery of the U.S. Ordnance Department, a solution had been brewing. It was a project that had been delayed, argued over, and deprioritized for years. It was the T-26E3. This wasn't a Sherman. It was a new breed. It was lower, wider, and meaner. It weighed 46 tons. It had heavy torsion bar suspension to handle the weight. It had 4 inches of frontal armor, sloped to deflect incoming fire. But the most important feature was the gun. It carried a high-velocity 90mm cannon, a weapon originally designed as an anti-aircraft gun, similar to the German 88. It fired a shell that didn't just knock on the door, it kicked it down. For months, General Gladion Barnes, the head of research and development, had been fighting the Sherman lobby in the Army ground forces to get this tank into production. The Battle of the Bulge ended the argument. The panic at Elsenborn and Bastogne proved that the era of the medium tank was over. The heavyweights were needed. In a frantic, secret operation codenamed the Zebra Mission, the Army rushed the first 20 production models of the T-26E3 to Europe. They arrived at the port of Antwerp in January 1945. The Battle of the Bulge was technically winding down, but the drive into Germany was just beginning. The secrecy was absolute. The tanks were covered in tarps. The crews selected to operate them, men from the 3rd Armored Division, the Spearhead Division, had no idea what they were looking at. When the tarps came off, the veteran tankers stared in silence. They were used to the high, boxy profile of the Sherman.
This new machine looked like a predator. It sat low to the ground. The gun barrel was incredibly long, equipped with a muzzle brake to handle the massive recoil. It looked like it belonged in the same weight class as the Panther. They called it the Pershing, named after General John "Black Jack" Pershing of World War I fame. But to the men who climbed inside, it was simply the answer. The training was rushed. There was no time for the proving grounds. The battlefield would be the test. The crews had to learn a completely new ammunition system. They had to learn how to handle the new transmission. They had to get used to a tank that didn't rattle and shake like a tractor, but glided on its suspension. But the biggest adjustment was psychological. For years, these men had been trained to run. They had been trained to flank, to use smoke, to hide. Now, the technical experts from the Zebra Mission told them something that sounded like a lie. You don't have to run. You can penetrate a tiger's front plate at 1,000 yards. And if they shoot you, you might actually survive. The crews were skeptical. They had seen too many friends burn. But they loaded the 90mm shells, massive, heavy rounds that felt like solid bars of steel. And they felt a glimmer of hope. In late February 1945, the 3rd Armored Division began its push toward the Rhine River. The weather was still miserable. Mud, rain, and the gray gloom of the German winter. The Pershings were dispersed among the Shermans, acting as the heavy hitters. The Germans, retreating but still dangerous, were waiting. They had their Tigers and Panthers hidden in the rubble of villages and the tree lines of the Rhineland. They expected the usual routine. The Americans would advance. A Tiger would knock out the lead Sherman, and the rest would scatter. They had no idea that the game had changed. The first encounters were tentative. A Pershing would fire at a pillbox or a parked vehicle.
The crews marveled at the accuracy of the 90mm gun. It shot flat and fast. But the real test
The tank-on-tank violence had yet to happen. The rumors of a super tank began to drift across the lines to the German side, but the Wehrmacht commanders dismissed them. The Americans didn't build heavy tanks. It was likely just a tank destroyer with a roof. Then came the night of February 26th, near the town of Elsdorf. The 3rd Armored was grinding forward in the darkness. Leading the column was a T-26E3 named Fireball. The tank commander was Sergeant McIntyre. They were moving through the shattered streets, the ruins casting long shadows in the moonlight. The tension was suffocating. Urban combat is a tanker's worst nightmare. Enemies can be anywhere, above you, beside you, behind you. Lurking in the darkness of Elsdorf was a Tiger I. The German commander inside was a veteran. He heard the approaching engine. It sounded deeper, throatier than a Sherman. He watched the silhouette emerge from the gloom. It didn't look like a Sherman, but it didn't matter. He had a Tiger. He was invincible. The Tiger waited until Fireball was just 100 yards away. It was point-blank range. The German gunner pulled the trigger. The 88mm shell screamed through the dark. It didn't bounce. It smashed directly into the gun mantlet of the Pershing, the thickest part of the turret. The impact was devastating. The shell penetrated the armor, killed the gunner and the loader instantly, and then rattled around inside the turret like a lottery ball in a tumbler. Fireball was dead. The Tiger backed away into the rubble, the crew celebrating another easy kill against the American armor. To the Germans, it seemed like business as usual. They had knocked out the new American toy. They proved once again that German steel was superior. But they had missed something crucial. The Pershing hadn't burned. Usually, when a Sherman was hit by an 88, the ammunition ignited, the fuel tank exploded,
And the tank became a torch. Fireball had been penetrated, yes, but it hadn't catastrophically detonate. The crew in the hull had survived, and more importantly, the Americans recovered the tank the next day. They looked at the hull, they looked at the damage, and they realized something that would terrify the Germans. The Pershing could be fixed. But the Americans weren't interested in just fixing tanks. They were interested in revenge. And just a few miles away, another Pershing crew was warming up their engine. They had heard about Fireball. They knew the Tigers were in Elsdorf. And they decided that the days of running away were over. The next morning, the 3rd Armored launched a counterattack to clear Elsdorf. A Pershing, commanded by Sergeant Mashlonik, moved into position. He spotted a Tiger I parked near a barn, watching the road. It was likely the same cat that had killed Fireball. The German turret began to turn. The familiar, terrifying slow rotation of the 88mm gun. In any other tank, Mashlonik would have screamed for the driver to reverse. He would have popped smoke. He would have prayed. Instead, he yelled, "Gunner, traverse right! Steady! Fire!" The 90mm gun roared. The heavy recoil rocked the 46-ton tank. The shell didn't bounce. It didn't shatter. It hit the Tiger. And for the first time in the long, bloody campaign from Normandy to the Rhine, the physics of the battlefield worked in the Americans' favor. The German tankers, who had spent years laughing at the Allied armor, were about to find out that the joke was finally over. The 90mm armor-piercing shell left the barrel of Sergeant Mashlonik's Pershing at a velocity of nearly 2,800 feet per second. It crossed the short distance between the two tanks faster than the human brain could process the muzzle flash. For the German crew inside the Tiger, there was no time to realize their mistake. They had paused. They had assumed the American tank would bounce a shot, or miss, or retreat. They had relied on the myth of their own invincibility, a myth forged in the hedgerows of Normandy and the frozen forests of the Bulge. But physics does not care about myths. The American shell struck the Tiger. It didn't ricochet. It didn't shatter. It punched through the hardened steel of the German heavy tank with catastrophic violence. The kinetic energy transfer was so immense that the Tiger didn't just stop. It shuddered as if hit by a freight train. The ammunition inside the German tank, stored in the sponsons, detonated instantly. A pillar of fire erupted from the commander's hatch, climbing 50 feet into the night sky. The turret, a massive assembly of steel weighing several tons, was lifted bodily off the hull by the force of the internal explosion, crashing down onto the cobblestones with the sound of a falling church bell. Silence returned to the street in Elsdorf, broken only by the crackle of the burning German machine. Sergeant Mashlonik and his crew sat in their Pershing, the smell of cordite filling the fighting compartment, stunned by what they had just done. For years, the standing order for an American tank meeting a Tiger was to call for air support or smoke and run. Mashlonik had just stood his ground and knocked the bully out cold with a single punch. The destruction of the Elsdorf Tiger was the turning point. It was the moment the Tiger phobia began to crack. Word spread through the 3rd Armored Division like wildfire. "The new tank works," the crews whispered. "It kills them. It actually kills them." The psychological weight that had pressed down on the American tankers, the feeling of being second-class citizens in the hierarchy of armor, began to lift. They were no longer the prey. They were the hunters. But the true test of the Pershing, the moment that would be immortalized on film and etched into military history, was yet to come. It would happen a few days later, in the ruins of a city that had been reduced to a skeleton of brick and ash. Cologne. On March 6, 1945, the 3rd Armored Division pushed into the city. Cologne was a moonscape. The Allied bombing campaigns had flattened entire districts. The streets were choked with rubble, tram wires hung like spiderwebs, and the spires of the famous Cologne Cathedral loomed over the destruction like jagged fingers pointing at God. Leading the advance was a Pershing nicknamed Eagle 7. It was commanded by Sergeant Robert Early, but the man who would make history that day was the gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer. Smoyer was a quiet, unassuming man, but behind the optics of the 90mm gun, he was a surgeon. As the Americans pushed towards the cathedral, disaster struck. A German Panther tank, the sleek, deadly medium tank that many argued was superior even to the Tiger, was lying in ambush near the train station. A brave but unlucky American Sherman turned the corner and was immediately hit. The Panther's high-velocity 75mm gun put 3 rounds into the Sherman in rapid succession. The American tank burned. 3 of the crew were killed, including the commander, whose leg was severed. The cameraman attached to the unit, Jim Bates, was filming the carnage from a nearby building. He watched the Panther sitting in the shadows, its barrel traversing, looking for its next victim. The German tank commander was confident. He controlled the intersection. He had just killed a Sherman with contemptuous ease. Then Eagle 7 turned the corner. Clarence Smoyer, looking through his periscope, saw the Sherman burning. He saw the Panther. This was the ultimate duel. The Panther had better frontal armor than the Tiger 1. It was faster. It was lethal. In a Sherman, Smoyer would have been dead already. But he wasn't in a Sherman. The German commander saw the new American tank emerge from the rubble. He didn't recognize it. It didn't have the high silhouette of a Sherman. It was low, menacing. He hesitated. That split second of confusion, the "what is that" factor, cost him his life. Smoyer didn't hesitate. "Gunner, traverse right!" Sergeant Early screamed. But Smoyer was already there. He knew that the Pershing had a stabilizer. It could shoot on the move, though it was risky. But he didn't want to risk a miss. He yelled for the driver to stop. The Pershing lurched to a halt, the suspension rocking. The Panther's turret was swinging toward them. It was a race to the trigger. Smoyer fired. The 90mm shell slammed into the side of the Panther. Jim Bates, filming from the window, captured the exact moment of impact. Sparks showered from the German steel. The tank rocked. Smoyer didn't wait to see if he had penetrated. He was a professional. He demanded another round. "Up!" the loader screamed. Smoyer fired again. This round hit the gun mantlet, shattering the firing mechanism and sending shrapnel into the crew compartment. Then a third round. The Panther didn't just die. It cooked. The fuel tanks ignited. A catastrophic fire engulfed the German tank. The crew began to bail out, tumbling from the hatches with their uniforms on fire, rolling in the street. The Invincible German machine had been reduced to a burning wreck in less than 30 seconds. This footage, known today as the Cologne Tank Duel, became the most famous tank footage of World War II. But for the men on the ground, it wasn't cinema. It was vindication. Smoyer and the crew of Eagle 7 had looked the Wehrmacht's finest in the eye and blinked last. They proved that the Pershing wasn't just a match for German armor. In the hands of a skilled crew, it was the executioner. As the 3rd Armored crossed the Rhine and drove deep into the heart of Germany, the Pershings led the way. The Germans, now fighting on their own soil, found their nightmares inverted. For years, they had relied on the range advantage of their guns. They would sit on a hill 2 kilometers away and pick off the approaching Shermans like ducks in a shooting gallery. But now, when they opened fire at long range, the Americans fired back. And they hit. There is a report from the Harz Mountains in April 1945 that illustrates this shift perfectly. A column of German vehicles, including a Tiger and several Panzer IVs, was moving along a ridgeline, believing they were safely out of range of the American column in the valley below. They were wrong. A platoon of Pershings stopped. The gunners dialed in the range, over 2,500 yards. They opened fire. The high-velocity 90mm shells screamed across the valley. The Tiger was hit before it could even traverse its turret. The Panzer IVs were picked off one by one. The German column disintegrated. It was a turkey shoot. The German prisoners taken later that day were in a state of shock. They kept asking to see the super guns. They couldn't believe that American tanks could kill from that distance. They had grown so used to the technological disparity being in their favor that when the playing field was leveled, they crumbled. But the story of the Pershing has one final, almost mythical chapter. It involves a single tank known as the Super Pershing. If the standard Pershing was a heavyweight boxer, the Super Pershing was a monster built in a mad scientist's lab. The Ordnance Department had taken one of the T-26E3s and fitted it with an experimental long-barreled T-15E1 gun. This cannon was absurdly powerful. It fired a shell at such high velocity that it could penetrate the frontal armor of a King Tiger, the most heavily armored tank in the world, at combat ranges. There was only one of them in Europe. It was sent to the 3rd Armored Division as a field test. The maintenance crews, realizing they had a unique beast, decided to make it even tougher. They scavenged steel plates from a destroyed German Panther and welded them onto the front of the Super Pershing.
It looked terrifying. A Frankenstein's monster of American engineering and German scrap metal, with a gun barrel so long it needed extra springs just to keep it level. Near the town of Dessau, in the dying days of the war, the Super Pershing got its chance. It turned a corner and came face to face with a German heavy tank. Accounts vary. Some say it was a King Tiger, others a Panther. It didn't matter. The German tank fired first. The shell struck the makeshift armor on the front of the Super Pershing and bounced off. The American crew, shaken but alive, fired back. The long-barreled 90mm gun unleashed a round with so much energy that it didn't just penetrate the German tank. It reportedly cleaved through the entire vehicle, entering the front and exiting the rear, turning the inside of the tank into a blast furnace. The debris from the explosion was so violent, it nearly buried the Super Pershing. The King had been dethroned by a mutant American tank that looked like it had been built in a junkyard. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over. The Pershing had arrived too late to change the strategic course of the war. The Shermans and the logistics had already done the heavy lifting. But for the men who fought in them, the Pershing was everything. It was the difference between feeling like a target and feeling like a soldier. The psychological impact of the M26 Pershing cannot be overstated. For 6 months, from Normandy to the Bulge, the American tanker lived with the knowledge that his equipment was inferior. He lived with the Tiger phobia that gnawed at his confidence. The arrival of the Pershing ended that fear. It proved that American industry could do more than just mass produce. It could innovate. It could build a machine that didn't just win by numbers, but won by force. In the end, the German tankers were victims of their own arrogance. They believed that the Tiger was the pinnacle of armored warfare, a masterpiece that could never be surpassed.
They stopped looking over their shoulders. They underestimated the resourcefulness of their enemy. They thought they were invincible. But on a cold night in Elsdorf and in the ruined streets of Cologne, they learned the hardest lesson of warfare. There is always a bigger fish. And when that fish has a white star painted on the side and a 90mm gun pointed at your face, the myth of the master race burns just as easily as the gasoline in a Panther's fuel tank. The Pershing went on to serve in Korea, evolving into the Patton series of tanks that would define the Cold War. But its true legacy was forged in those final, bloody months of World War II, when it gave the American tanker the one thing he needed most: a fair fight. And in a fair fight, the Nazis never stood a chance.